It's Friday, it's 12:15, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights from across the UK. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hume. On the programme this week, the Chancellor delivers his spring statement.
My tax plan delivers the biggest net cut to personal taxes in over a quarter of a century.
His choices are making the cost of living crisis worse, not better.
800 staff sacked without notice by P&O Ferries.
If the Prime Minister can't stop that, what's the point of his government?
It looks to me, Mr. Speaker, as though the company concerned has broken the law, and we will be taking action, therefore.
And the boss gets a grilling from MPs.
It was our assessment that the change was of such a magnitude that no union could possibly accept our proposal.
Oh, you're right about that, Mr. Hamilton. I've never heard such farcical answers to a series of questions.
And is the Welsh Government doing enough to protect Welsh farming?
Food production in rural Wales is under serious threat like never before. And some of this is because of this Welsh Government's policies on agriculture and climate change. This must stop.
Obviously, the pandemic has caused global disruption in the way you refer. However, your Chancellor had the opportunity to do something about it today, and he didn't do it.
Let's start here in Westminster with Susan Hume. Susan, we saw there in the headlines, it's been a big week in Westminster with the Chancellor's spring statement. Not a budget, but still very significant. What did you make of it?
Well, it did strike me watching that for an ambitious young politician, Rishi Sunak has been quite unlucky to become Chancellor when he did, because, of course, we had the pandemic with all the money he had to spend then. And then the war in Ukraine has turbocharged the problems that he already had with those rising living costs, and really the biggest hit to people's pockets since the 1950s, I'm told. So MPs wanted to see what he was going to do about it to help. A lot of MPs, a lot of Conservatives as well, had hoped that he would at least scrap his own squeeze to our incomes, which is that rise in national insurance, or NICS as they like to call it, which kicks in next month. However, he didn't do that. He did raise the level at which people start paying it, but he didn't scrap the rise at the same time. He did make a few other changes to taxes, for example, on fuel duty, quite a big cut there. However, there was perhaps no big ticket item to help people, particularly the poorest people, and I think that caused some concern. However, what he'd really like to be is a tax-cutting Chancellor. So he did signal that. He signalled a cut to income tax, but not for another couple of years, not till 2024, right before the general election. Some might think is significant. Conservatives definitely liked that and cheered it. However, I thought this was striking because normally Chancellors like to look to the sunny uplands of how the economy is going to be, and he didn't even try to do that. It was pretty downbeat, his look, at least in the short term.
It is too early to know the full impact of the Ukraine war on the UK economy. But their initial view, combined with high global inflation and continuing supply chain pressures, means the OBR now forecasts growth this year of 3.8%. The government will support the British people as they deal with the rising costs of energy. People should know that we will stand by them as we have throughout the last 2 years. Today, I can announce, for only the second time in 20 years, fuel duty will be cut. Not by 1, not even by 2, but by 5 pence per litre. The biggest cut to all fuel duty rates ever. And while some have called for the cut to last until August, I have decided it will be in place until March next year, a full 12 months. Together with the freeze, it's a tax cut this year for hard-working families and businesses worth over £5 billion. We are helping families with the cost of living, creating the conditions for accelerated growth and productivity, and making sure the proceeds of growth are shared fairly. That is not the work of any one statement, but it does begin today, and with one of our most important levers, the tax system. Our current plan is to increase the NICS threshold this year by £300. But I'm not going to do that, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to increase it by the full £3,000. Delivering our promise to fully equalise the NICS and income tax thresholds, and not incrementally over many years, but in one go this year. From this July, people will be able to earn £12,570 a year without paying a single penny of income tax or national insurance. That is a £6 billion personal tax cut for 30 million people across the United Kingdom. A tax cut for employees worth over £330 a year, the largest increase in a basic rate threshold ever, and the largest single personal tax cut in a decade. I can confirm before the end of this Parliament in 2024, for the first time in 16 years, the basic rate of income tax will be cut from 20 to 19 pence in the pound. A tax cut for workers, for pensioners, for savers. A £5 billion tax cut for 30 million people. And let me be clear with the House, it is fully costed and fully paid for in the plans announced today. Let me end by simply saying this. My tax plan delivers the biggest net cut to personal taxes in over a quarter of a century, and I commend it to this House.
Plenty of cheers there, Susan, from the Conservative benches at that point. That was the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, delivering his spring statement. The response, of course, comes from the Shadow Chancellor when it is the spring statement, Rachel Reeves, giving Labour's response.
As you say, there's always the cheering from his own side. The next 24 hours, there's lots of picking over the details, and I think some of the newspaper headlines the following day were not quite so cheering. They were a bit negative, actually. Conservatives in the moment really did cheer, as we were hearing just then, but the opposition parties were saying he'd made political choices that had failed to help the poorest, and that there was more that could have been done. For example, to hit some of the big energy producers and make them help to pay for some of those big bills that households are facing.
Today was the day that the Chancellor could have put a windfall tax on oil and gas producers to provide real help to families. But he didn't. Today was the day the Chancellor could have set out a proper plan to support businesses and create good jobs. But he didn't. Today was the day that he could have properly scrapped his national insurance hike. He didn't. People are worried sick. For all his words, it is clear that the Chancellor does not understand the scale of the challenge. He talks about providing security for working families, but his choices are making the cost of living crisis worse, not better. The truth is, Mr. Speaker, people can no longer afford the Conservatives. Working families can't, pensioners can't, and businesses can't. The weak growth forecast we've seen today should be flashing red on the Chancellor's desk. And the Chancellor says, in his statement today, that the work starts today. Is he serious? The Conservatives have been in government now for 12 years. Not 12 hours. What has taken them so long?
This tax plan that the Chancellor announced is very thin, it is lightweight and it is superficial, and it's exactly what we've come to expect from this Chancellor. Because what we heard today from the Chancellor was not enough. It was utterly detached from the needs of our constituents up and down these islands. This has been a cost of living crisis over a decade in the making, layer upon layer. Mr. Speaker, we know that sanctioning Russia is not cost-free. But the Tories cannot use this as a sleight of hand to distract from the layers of pain which lie beneath the current crisis. Each of these layers has seen political choices and opportunities for change squandered by this UK Tory government and its predecessors, and we see this again today. And this Chancellor has increased taxes more in 2 years than Gordon Brown did in 10, while people are struggling.
There appears to be no plan from the Chancellor, glossy or otherwise, for farming and food security. Is he aware that hundreds and hundreds of farmers are leaving the industry because of the botching of the transition from the old basic payment system to the new system? As it stands, we are seeing farmers leave the industry just at the moment we're facing an international food security crisis.
Former Lib Dem leader Tim Farron there reacting to the spring statement. Thank you for the moment, Susan. We'll come back to you a little later. Let's go to Holyrood and find out what's been happening there this week with our correspondent Lindsay Bewes. Hello to you, Lindsay. The delivery of 2 ferries for Scotland's island communities were in the spotlight this week. The public spending watchdog producing what's been described as a damning report on the handling of the project. Tell us about it.
Yeah, that's right, Joe. This issue has really dominated here at Holyrood this week. We have now learned that these 2 ferries, which were being built for the state-owned CalMac network, are going to be 5 years late and at least 2.5 years over budget. Now, the Audit Scotland report identified a multitude of failings in the project, which was awarded to the Ferguson shipyard in 2015, and those problems continued after that yard was nationalised in 2019. And the Audit Scotland report also questioned why ministers had given the contract to Ferguson's despite concerns over the yard's inability to provide the mandatory financial guarantees. And that point was honed in on by the Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross.
There is a 5-year delay at least, and there's still 175 faults with the ferries that are still being built. This is one of the worst public spending disasters since devolution. And who messed up? Who knows in SNP Secret Scotland? Because all the evidence is gone. Audit Scotland couldn't get to the bottom of a number of points. The only scraps of paper we have left about this disastrous decision are the old SNP press releases that claimed they were saving Scottish shipbuilding. So, First Minister, can I ask, when you visited the ferries in 2016, were the painted-on windows not a sign that your decision was an absolute shocker?
I said candidly at the outset, I think this is a deeply regrettable situation. At the time I visited the yard, of course, it was in private ownership. Assurances were given there about the completion of work, and the problems that have led to cost overruns, delays and, worst of all, a negative impact on our island communities is deeply regrettable. At every step, the motivation of the government has been to secure employment, to secure the shipyard and to get these ferries completed, and that is what we will continue to focus on. We will learn the lessons in the Audit Scotland report. We will make sure that all of the recommendations in it are taken forward. But Douglas Ross may think it is unimportant to have saved 300 jobs and a shipyard. I actually think these things matter, and that is why we will now focus on making sure that that yard has a positive future.
Now, the government is facing calls for a public inquiry into this. Nicola Sturgeon stopped short of agreeing to that. She did say the government would look at what kind of review was needed after these 2 vessels are completed.
Lindsay, opposition parties have been pressing the government on who will take personal responsibility for this project.
That's right, yes. The First Minister was pressed on that, who took the decision to award this contract. Now, she pointed out that Derek Mackay, who is no longer in government, no longer in Parliament, was Transport Minister at the time, but she did say that the buck for these kind of decisions stops with her. Opposition parties also pressing on who would take responsibility going forward, and that was a point that was put to the Finance Secretary, Kate Forbes, when she addressed Parliament.
Presiding Officer, I know that there is a shared belief across this chamber in the importance of those vessels, and it is critical that we see them in service as soon as possible for the benefit of our island communities. I reiterate today that there are no ifs, there are no buts. Those vessels must be completed, and they must be completed as quickly and as effectively as possible. The board and the leadership of Ferguson Marine know where I stand on this issue. They expect to be held to account for delivery of these critical ferries in line with the new schedule they've communicated to Parliament today. And until those vessels are serving the communities for which they were built, we will not let up in our drive and determination to get them finished.
We've heard again the tough talk of no ifs, no buts, and these ferries must be delivered as soon as possible. These ferries are already estimated to be 5 years late. The reality is the only chance islanders are going to see a new ferry this year is if they take a holiday to Marmaris. The question for the Cabinet Secretary is she going to stake her reputation on this, or is this just more words again? If it's not just words, can Kate Forbes confirm if these ferries are not ready by May and December 2023, then she will resign? If you're not confident enough, Cabinet Secretary, to stake your position on this, why should any islanders have any confidence in what you are saying now? And what is the point in being responsible for this if you're just going to keep passing the buck?
Now, Kate Forbes wouldn't stake her job on this. These ferries are due to be completed next year. That timetable will be closely scrutinised, and that costing currently sitting at £250 million, while there are fears that that could go up even further.
Lindsay, after the spring statement from the Chancellor this week, Scottish Labour have some proposals on tackling the cost of living.
That's right, yes, this is an issue that Scottish Labour have returned to repeatedly. They did so once again this week, and one of the new proposals they have brought forward is a £100 rebate for households on water charges, and they say that water charges should also be frozen. They say that Scottish Water is sitting on a surplus of £428 million, and that should now be used to help households that are struggling. So here is Scottish Labour leader Anna Sarwar raising this issue once again at First Minister's Questions.
The First Minister can take action to tackle the cost of living crisis. And let's look at the stories over the last week, the tragic stories from across the country. People stealing fuel canisters in the Highlands. Families turning down fresh vegetables from food banks because they can't afford to turn on the gas cooker. And people digging up their gardens to grow their own food because they can't afford to buy it. That's why Labour has set out the actions both governments should take. A windfall tax on oil and gas giants to reduce bills by £600, the £200 as a grant, not a loan, and here in Scotland a £400 support payment to support struggling families, a £100 rebate on water bills, and a freeze on water charges and rail fares. That is real help, supporting families with over £1,000, a contrast to this government's flagship cost of living policy, which would give families less than £4 a week.
If you look at the Joseph Roundy Foundation analysis published this morning, those in the lowest income decile are going to see their household incomes cut by almost 6%. The main reason for that is the failure to uprate benefits by more than 3.1%. Where we have control of benefits here, we've uprated them by 6%. Now, the reason we can't do that for the main benefits, like universal credit, for example, is because we do not have the power. And I'm afraid, and it's the same reason why we cannot impose a windfall tax to help with energy costs. It's the same reason why energy costs may remain reserved. Because when it came to a choice between yes and no, Anna Sarwar encouraged people to vote no, and because people voted no, these powers remain in the hands of Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak.
Now, you heard there Nicola Sturgeon expressing frustration about powers lying at Westminster. Well, unsurprisingly, that doesn't cut much ice with the opposition parties here. And as for the UK government, well, they would point to those actions announced in the spring statement that you've already been discussing on the programme, Joe.
Lindsay, thank you very much. Lindsay Buse there at Holyrood. Time to return to Westminster and Susan Hume. Another big story and heated debate around the way P&O ferries have behaved by sacking 800 staff last week without notice. Now, there's been a lot of anger this week from MPs over the behaviour of the company.
There really has. My goodness, they have managed to unite the parties across the Commons in absolute fury about the way that these workers were sacked, the fact that they were sacked and the way they were sacked on the spot. They'd sent in security guards to get people off the ships, their belongings put in bin bags. It caused absolute fury. And also in the Commons, there were questions about whether the government could have done something about this in advance. And indeed, what they're going to do about it now, if anything can still be done.
Since the Prime Minister came to office, P&O have received over £38 million of government contracts. And the parent company, DP World, is lined up for £50 million of taxpayers' money under the Freeport scheme. Can the Prime Minister guarantee that these companies will not get a penny more of taxpayers' money or a single tax break until they reinstate the workforce?
If he's asking this government to do what Labour usually want us to do and actively pitchfork away investment around the country from overseas, Mr. Speaker, then that is not what we will do. We'll take them to court, we'll defend the rights of British workers. What we will not do, Mr. Speaker, is launch a wholehearted campaign, as they would want, against overseas investment.
The Prime Minister keeps telling us just how opposed he is to fire and rehire. But as we saw on Monday, Mr. Speaker, as we saw on Monday, he doesn't have the backbone to ban it. Whilst he sits on his hands, more and more workers are having their lives thrown upside down by this appalling practice. What good to them is a Prime Minister who's all mouth and no trousers?
We will be vindicating the rights of British workers, UK employees under UK law, but the law that the P&O, the company themselves, are allegedly relying on was introduced, I can tell him, as a result of EU directives. Never forget, Mr. Speaker, and he may not like it, that's the reality. He would have kept us unable to change it, unable to get out of it. He would have made it impossible for us to protect UK employees in the way that we're going to do.
82,000 seafarers in this country. I've spoken to dockers, engineers, deckhands and sailors. They're all worried about what this means for them. This morning, one of them said to me, if P&O can get away with this, other companies will get rid of us too and replace us with cheap labour from abroad. Why does the Prime Minister think that they will take a crumb of comfort from his half-assed bluster and waffle today?
Mr. Speaker, P&O plainly aren't going to get away with it any more than any other company that treats its employees in that scandalous way, Mr. Speaker. The economy is now bigger than it was before the pandemic began, and we will continue to get the big calls right, as we got the big calls right during the pandemic. They got the big calls wrong. They would do absolutely nothing to protect workers, let alone P&O workers, Mr. Speaker, because not only would they have kept us in lockdown and kept those ships in port, Mr. Speaker, unable to move, that's the reality.
Heated clashes there at Prime Minister's questions about the issue of P&O. On Thursday, the Chief Executive, Susan, of P&O Ferries was summoned to appear before the Transport and Business Select Committees. What happened there?
Yeah, it was a chance for them to ask some questions of him to get to the bottom of it. It was, of course, another opportunity for MPs to express just how furious they are. He obviously knew that was going to happen, so he got his apology in early, as witnesses always like to do before these committees of MPs now. It doesn't really make much difference anymore. They were still pretty furious. However, I thought the MPs were pretty astonished as well at some of his answers, particularly when they were asking him about whether P&O had acted unlawfully by not consulting workers first over those redundancies.
P&O has lost an unsustainable amount of money. And the reality is, and this is the backdrop that I would ask you please to bear in mind, is that we would have had to close the business.
There's many companies that have difficulties. They obey the law and they consult with their members through their trade unions. You haven't done that.
We've moved from one operating model to another. And
You haven't escaped the law of this country. You've still got to do it within the legal framework. You can't just decide that you're going to absent yourself from the legal system of the United Kingdom.
So it was our assessment that the change was of such a magnitude that no union could possibly accept our proposal.
Oh, you're right about that, Mr. Hamilton. I've never heard such farcical answers to a series of questions.
Is it accurate that you said that the Minister was informed on the 27th of November?
22nd.
22nd of November?
Is my understanding. Which one?
Which Minister?
The Secretary of State for Transport. If I misspoke, I apologise.
You have a minute of that conversation?
I don't know.
Thank you.
You said to this committee today that you willfully broke the law. You chose not to consult, even though you know you should have done, but you decided to pay people off with compensation in order to break the law. Does that not give you concern that you're in breach of your legal obligations as a company director under company law?
So, as I say, I completely hold our hands up, that we did choose not to consult.
That's quite amazing, isn't it? You're coming to this Parliament and putting your hands up and saying you willfully chose to break the law.
We did not believe that there was any other way to do this, and we are compensating people in full.
Any idea what happens next, Susan?
Well, it was interesting because there were two ministers listening to that evidence. And actually, they seemed a bit taken aback as well by the way that the chief executive there was saying that they had chosen to break the law, to not consult, as they were expected to. So Robert Courts, the Transport Minister, said the government would be looking to see if there was anything that could still be done in the short term. However, I thought it was interesting that he also said that for the long term, beyond P&O perhaps, the government was looking at a package it could bring in to prevent this happening again, and that they would be bringing that to Parliament just next week.
Susan, thank you for the moment. Let's go to our correspondent, Daniel Davies, who can tell us what's been happening in the Welsh Parliament. Hello to you, Daniel. We hear that the Welsh Government's verdict on the Chancellor's spring statement has been that Rishi Sunak just doesn't get it when it comes to cost of living. But what is the Welsh Government doing to tackle the cost of living crisis?
Well, they're saying that they're doing all that they can. A £300 million package of support has been announced, but there are questions about whether that is going to be enough given the scale of the challenge that we are all facing. Energy prices, of course, are a big factor in all of that, and that's going to be particularly difficult for people on prepayment meters, as the Labour Senedd member Ken Skates said when he asked the First Minister questions in the Chamber this week.
First Minister, no government should allow its people to freeze or starve, but that's exactly what's going to happen unless the Prime Minister and the Chancellor take immediate and dramatic action on energy costs. And I'm concerned that those who are struggling should not stay hidden, away from view, or deprived of essential support.
Some years ago, when I was involved in some university research on this matter, I was involved with the Fire Brigades Union that published a report into child death numbers. Child deaths caused by people forced to self-disconnect because they couldn't feed the meter, who used candles in bedrooms, where curtains caught fire, and children died. You know, that is the circumstances in which many families in Wales will find themselves again after next month.
A stark assessment there by Mark Drakeford. That was before the Chancellor's spring statement. The Welsh Government's verdict on that is to say that the national insurance increase is the wrong way to raise extra revenue for the health service. But it's worth saying that the Welsh Government has actually banked a lot of that money already. Next year's budget has a bumper settlement for the NHS to bring down waiting times, although now we see the forecasts for high inflation. A lot of that extra money is just going to be eaten up by that rise in inflation.
Well, and Daniel, from a cost of living crisis to a housing crisis, which continues to provoke fierce debate in the Senedd.
Yeah, second homes, holiday homes have been a controversial issue in Wales for years, and now the Welsh Government, in the deal between Labour and Plaid Cymru, has promised to restrict the market through changes to the tax and planning system. One of those changes could be a hike in council tax. Councils are already allowed to double council tax on holiday homes. This week, Senedd members were asked to approve powers that would allow councils to quadruple the level of council tax on holiday homes, much to the dismay of the Conservatives.
The only way you find of addressing problems is through tax, tax, tax. This is a tax on aspiration, it's a tax on tourism, and it's a tax against people visiting Wales. So I suggest the government gets on, build more houses and put policies in place that actually support young people to buy homes and not tax people off the face of this earth.
It is a crisis and it is entirely immoral. We must take steps to resolve this, and I speak on behalf of every one of these people that I've seen over the past few weeks who are living in inappropriate accommodation or are homeless, and I welcome any steps brought forward in order to seek to address this huge inequality and injustice.
We've taken a whole system approach backed by significant investment to tackle these issues. In this financial year alone, we've made £11 million available to local authorities whose communities are affected by second home ownership and holiday lets, so that they can buy and renovate those empty homes for social housing.
So those council tax powers were passed. Other reforms are coming on business rates, on land transaction tax, which is the successor to stamp duty in Wales, on the planning system. Campaigners have been waiting years to see all this stuff, but critics, as you got a flavour from it there, say this is a smokescreen to make up for the fact that the Welsh Government just hasn't built enough houses before now.
We heard in the headlines, Daniel, about concerns over Welsh farming. The Conservatives saying the Welsh Government isn't doing enough to protect Welsh farming, including from the impact of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, the war is affecting politics here in all sorts of ways, whether it's services for refugees or the impact on the economy, including the agricultural economy. Food and fertiliser prices are rising. It's a big concern for farmers in Wales. The Conservatives, and Plaid Cymru agree, say that the Welsh Government needs to convene a food summit to try and sort all this out.
Food production in rural Wales is under serious threat like never before, and some of this is because of this Welsh Government's policies on agriculture and climate change. This must stop, and a Just Transition Commission established to ensure the burden of decarbonisation does not fall unequally on our rural communities.
Obviously, the pandemic has caused global disruption in the way you refer. However, your Chancellor had the opportunity to do something about it today, and he didn't do it. £5 billion to take 5 pence off a litre of fuel. That's no good for people who haven't got food, money for food or money for energy, or who haven't got a car.
All sides blaming each other in that debate. The Tories saying that environmental regulations are hurting farmers, Labour blaming Brexit and the Treasury. The Rural Affairs Minister says she talks to farmers and food producers all the time. No need, she says, for a special food security summit.
Daniel Davis there. Thank you for bringing us up to date from the Welsh Parliament. Let's go to Stormont now and speak to our reporter there, Jim Fitzpatrick. Hello to you, Jim. It's been the last sitting week of the Assembly before the election. What's been happening?
Well, yes, Joe, the election which happened 5 years ago, now the mandate draws to a close here at Stormont, and it finishes in the same way it began, with no devolved government. In fact, over that period, there has been no actual government here for more than half of the time. Of course, the most recent one is over the last number of weeks, and the Assembly has tried nonetheless to get through legislation, but it has been complicated by that lack of executive government. So, for instance, this week, one of the things they were were doing was extending the powers of the Health Minister relating to COVID. Of course, COVID hasn't gone away, so they have to be prepared for that. But that was challenged by one prominent DUP critic because of the lack of executive government. It was supported, though, by most MLAs, including Alliance's Paula Bradshaw.
It is worth emphasising that in practice, in the absence of a functioning executive, the law will only be able to be used on the same basis as the one on which restrictions were all removed last month, with the written consent of ministers representing all parties in the executive. This renders it, in practice, less than draconian than some like to claim ahead of an election. But it also demonstrates how the uncertainty around the future of a functioning executive is a relevant consideration here.
This motion here today before us will grant the Health Minister, no matter who that is, and his department, extensive, sweeping and draconian power. And I would question, and I would ask the Minister to address in his closing remarks, if he feels that he can't use these powers after today because of the lack of an executive, because the powers are controversial and cross-cutting, I would ask the Minister, how then can he come today before this Assembly when these same powers and this motion is cross-cutting and controversial? Member, if I was Minister of Health today, I would not be bringing this motion forward. Thank you.
I don't think that'll be under any illusion, but I would also be in fear of how many people we would have had in our hospitals, how many people would not actually walk in the streets of Northern Ireland today in regards to some of the positions that the member may have taken should he have been in this position. But that's an assumption, and again, it may be unfair in regards to that because nobody knows how each individual who has held this post over the last 2 years, no matter where they are, should have been Northern Ireland or across the jurisdiction, would have reacted. And I think that's what we've also seen in regards, and I think when Mr Frew also talked about the government's approach, what the executive did, I would remind him that his party has, or had, the most ministers in that government, in that executive. So for many, if not the majority of the decisions that were taken, they were made with the full support of his party's ministers.
Now, that doesn't mean that new regulations are coming in. It just gives the Minister power if he needs them. A reminder that much as we might like COVID to have disappeared, it hasn't gone away yet.
No, indeed, Jim, and something completely different. There was a private member's bill on defamation passed this week. Why the need for that?
Well, that's because Northern Ireland here has been a bit of an outlier. It hasn't enjoyed the same reforms on libel that have taken place in England, Wales and Scotland. And as such, journalists here would complain that this has had a chilling effect on their work. So, for instance, when I'm not here, quite often I'm working on long-form current affairs investigations. And a senior BBC lawyer gave evidence here at Stormont where he said that perhaps me and my colleagues here in Northern Ireland create a disproportionate amount of work, it seems, for the BBC legal department because of the law that has existed. Now, this new bill should hopefully reduce the work for my lawyerly friends in the BBC, but more importantly, perhaps, for journalists working across all organisations on public interest stories, it should make their work that bit easier. The bill was brought by a former journalist and TV presenter, Mike Nesbitt of the Ulster Unionist Party, and while he was pleased that the legislation was passed, he was disappointed that certain elements relating to new media had to be dropped.
My biggest regret is that we are not doing anything with regard to the internet, where reputations are trashed minute by minute, if not second by second. But I understand I have failed to persuade the House of my proposals. Again, I hope that will be part of the review that the department officials in finance will undertake over the next couple of years. We also look to what other jurisdictions will be doing in this area, because it's not just an issue for us, and it's not just a national issue, it's an international issue, and a very difficult one to grapple.
While there have been disagreements on aspects of policy, nevertheless, the bill today is legally coherent thanks to this work. I made no secret of the fact that when I learnt that the bill sponsor sought to bring a private member's bill to this House, that I felt it would be preferable not to simply copy a law from 2013 from England and Wales. The practice and policy in this area of law has moved on from 2013, and we live in an age where people can be potentially defamed every second due to social media. So we need to adapt our laws to meet that challenge. The bill doesn't deal with these issues, but I accept that there are parts of the bill that will be useful.
So a lot of journalists cheering the passage of that bill. One of the last things to pass here at Stormont before the election on May the 5th, an election that doesn't guarantee the return of devolved government here in Northern Ireland. So, Joe, I'm afraid I can't say when I might next be speaking to you here from the steps of Stormont.
Well, Jim, I hope it won't be too long till we talk again. Until then, take good care. Let's return to Westminster and our correspondent here, Susan Hume. We've got time to bring you one more story. The Nationality and Borders Bill. We've talked about it before. It's reaching its final stages and returns to the Commons again, or it turned, I should say, this week, having been heavily amended by peers in the House of Lords. What happened?
Yeah, well, just as a reminder, this is the bill that the government says will mend what they consider a broken asylum system. And it's against the backdrop of all the record numbers of people coming across the channel in these small inflatable boats, often in the hands of people traffickers. However, it is massively controversial because, as envisaged by the government, it does things like criminalise people who arrive in the UK, as they say, illegally without the right papers. It also suggests that people should be processed for their asylum claims in another country, a foreign country. Not that any of them have said that they will actually do that, but it's in the bill. Now, the House of Lords stripped all of these things out of it. Back in the Commons, the government wanted MPs. They have a big majority in the Commons, so they wanted MPs to put it all back in again. The critics are still heavily against it. However, the government can do that in the Commons. The critics say it's rather heartless. However, the minister said, and his supporters too, that really these measures are needed because otherwise economic migrants, rather than genuine asylum seekers, as they would put it, are attracted to come here, and they need to get rid of those incentives.
This bill is about delivering a long-term solution to the long-term problems that have beset the asylum system over a period of decades. It has three central objectives: to make the system fairer and more effective so we can better protect and support those in genuine need, to deter illegal entry, breaking the business model of evil criminal trafficking, and to make it easier to remove those with no right to be here.
This bill, taken a whole, is a package. And if we start amending it in this way to really facilitate economic migration, we will end any chance we have of stopping cross-channel migration, stopping these evil criminal gangs, and taking back control of our borders. This is a package, and therefore I'm afraid we have to vote down all these amendments.
We should not really be surprised by the fact that the bill before us today doesn't only fail to meet any of the challenges our migration system faces, it actively makes the situation worse. And that is why we on these benches rejected this bill in its entirety at second reading, and it is also why we support every one of the Lord's amendments that we are debating today.
The problem is that the core idea at the heart of this bill, which was appalling from its outset last July, remains at the heart of the bill. And in short, that is the idea that we should punish and dehumanise certain refugees so as to disincentivise others from coming here.
I take the view that this bill is a serious attempt to deal with an almost intractable problem. Nobody should actually challenge that point. But we are a great nation, and our greatness rests on the fact that we take a moral stance on most things. Asylum offshoring would be a moral, economic and practical failure. Previous international experience shows that introducing it here will be a mitigated disaster.
Many of the amendments put forward by the Lords are carelessly critical. They're veiled, as these things so often are, in a thin cover of assumed moral superiority. But surely it is not moral to oppose a bill that tries to make the asylum system fit for purpose.
Now all that the Lord's amendments have been defeated, what next for the bill?
It goes back to the Lords again. It is the season where all these controversial bills are going back and forth between the Commons and Lords, trying to get an agreement. So the government either gets its way, the Lords backs down, or maybe there's a compromise.
That classic ping-pong. Well, that's all for this week's roundup of parliamentary news from across the UK. Thank you to Susan Human, all our correspondents. I'll be back on Monday with Politics Live. Until then, have a very good weekend. Bye-bye.